If you've been watching the channel lately, you know that our podcast sponsor, Johnson Plastics Plus, sent over a big free box of goodies for us to check out. We recently unboxed it, and I promised we would go in depth on each material individually and how they performed on the array of lasers in our shop. Today marks the beginning of that testing. We're kicking off the testing with the Saddle Collection Leather-like sheet, which is the Johnson Plastics Plus offering on synthetic leatherette. When we unboxed it, we were initially super impressed, but we're definitely looking forward to this testing to find out more about its performance across a spectrum of wavelengths and delivery systems. Make sure you stick around until the end of the video to see how this material performs on the UV laser specifically. It's pretty wild. If you're interested in seeing the rest of the results, don't go anywhere, because we're getting started right now. Getting started today, we're taking a look at the CO2 Gantry. As you can see, it was pretty smooth sailing right out of the gate. Since we are dealing with a synthetic leatherette, I figured it would be better to err on the side of caution and start with a high speed and low power to make sure we weren't melting anything. The cut settings were pretty much spot on the first time we tried this, and we had a really nice fine line. We had just adjusted the mirrors and there was hardly any kerf at all. When it was time to remove the leatherette, it popped right out. There were probably 1 or 2 strands of fringe leatherette left over, but they plucked right off when I pulled the patch. No big deal. Having just had a really successful run with the leatherette settings, I decided to see if we could kick the power up a little bit and get a darker result. Ultimately, that ended up being a mistake. I didn't get great footage of it, but essentially there were hundreds of microscopic holes where you could see through the leatherette if you held it up to the light. Maybe there's a middle ground between here and where we started, but I didn't think it was worth the time invested in hunting those settings down. Of course, I didn't give up immediately. There were a few failures before I decided that I should stop being stubborn. The real big bummer here is that it looks good when it's on the laser bed, but don't be fooled. This is not yielding a usable result. After a failed test or two, I decided to return to the settings I started with. If you remember the brown leatherette we had on screen a few seconds ago, the lower power, higher speed setting worked great, and it ended up working great on the gray leatherette as well. They actually darken up quite well after being cleaned, so this lighter color that you're seeing out of the CO2 right now is a little misleading. Again, we had no problem getting our cuts here. The kerf was a non-issue and the cut edge looked amazing. For the pixel peepers out there, here is a final photo of the results we got. Super clean detail from the Ranger with really nice edges. Of course, this requires you to have your laser dialed in. If you don't have your mirrors aligned, have a dirty lens, or aren't in focus, all of these things could cause issues with what you're trying to accomplish. That said, I'm super thrilled with what we have in front of us. I did go through and check every single one of those stitching holes and they are all intact. This speaks volumes not only about the Ranger, but about the leatherette, which seems to stand up really well to burnout, so we don't have any fire spreading around, eating away at edges and causing problems. Overall, I'm really impressed. I do prefer the contrast of the gray over the brown, but there are definitely people out there who will like the brown better, and that's fine too. There weren't a lot of surprises with the CO2 Gantry. It did what it was supposed to do, and I think we're ready to move on. This one particular clip was recorded really dark, so it's a bit grainy. Sorry about that. I know everybody wants to see the Galvo lasers in action, but before that, I'm trying to cover the most common lasers that may be used with this product. So next up is the X-Tool D1 Pro with the 10 watt module, today's ambassador for diode lasers. After our experience with the CO2 Gantry, I decided to keep the power light from here on out. As you saw in the final CO2 Gantry photo, we really did get good contrast on the leatherette after it was cleaned up, so I'm not particularly worried about hitting this super hard. I went into the X-Tool library to get started and found settings for a weird yellow leatherette, which ended up working perfectly for the brown, and as you'll see in a minute, the gray. The leatherette is really thin, but out of the box, these settings worked well. I also want to mention that the diode laser almost had the best performance with cutting, which isn't really a surprise given the super tight dot size. The only one that did better with cutting was the UV laser, but we're seeing a really fine curve here. Of all the machines we tested, this is definitely one of the strongest if you're concerned about the integrity of those really close cuts. I was using the air assist here and you can see that the cut is just buttery smooth. Not much else to see on the gray, but I'll show you a bit here. The process was just as smooth. I used the exact same settings and didn't have to change anything. The diode produced really great detail and outperformed the CO2 dot size. Older diodes are known for being a bit slower, but with the newer higher wattage modules and newer gantries, they're actually pretty quick these days and can get a lot of work done, especially if you're ganging projects like these patches up into sheets. If you have a keen eye, you'll notice I started the cut before the engraving, so I stopped and restarted it. Despite that, we're seeing the same great results with the cut on the gray that we saw on the brown. And here are the final results for the Gantry diode, and overall, I'm super happy with these and would recommend a diode laser for this material. Rendering of highly detailed areas is exceptional, while large fill areas are pristine and free of heavy soot, burn marks, or hot spots. Cut edges are potentially the cleanest we've seen during our time with this material. Another thing I'll mention is that while we do struggle to enjoy strong contrast from the brown leatherette on a lot of these machines, that doesn't seem to be an issue here with the diode laser. For those of you patient enough to process this material with a diode system, I do think that patience will be rewarded with a high quality final product. It's time to take a look at the Diode Galvo now, and in this case, we're using the original Xtool F1. As you probably know, the F1 is a dual source laser, so we tested both with the IR laser and the blue light diode. The F1 is definitely the laser that took the most practice to get a good mark with, as just about everything in Xtool's library was a letdown. Here we're looking at my first attempt with my own settings on the IR module. The mark did pretty well right off the bat, though I do think we could tighten up the interval to get rid of some of these scan lines. Additionally, a crosshatch probably would have been a nice fit for this module, as it's such low wattage. We don't have the same concerns with penetrating the material as we do on other lasers. The main issue was the cut settings, which were just simply too hot. If you're going to cut this material, you need a lot of power and speed, but it's all about balance, and we definitely didn't strike that on the first attempt. Too much power led to a fiery mess, and I absolutely don't recommend doing this material unattended on any machine, even if you have your settings dialed in. Attempt number 2 went much better in terms of both engraving and cut settings. I felt even more confident after the same exact settings worked perfectly on the gray material. While you don't have to use leather cleaner on leatherette, I found it works nicely for removing the easily smudged ash left over from marking and leaves a clean black finish on the marked area. I also cleaned up the edges from cutting by making sure to wipe down both the front and the back surface before calling it done. I was pretty pleased with the final result, but I thought the text could use a little work. I think tightening up the interval and potentially adding a crosshatch would resolve a lot of the issues I have with the final results, which you can see here. They cleaned up pretty well, and with just a little more tuning, I think we can get processing with the IR module close to perfect. That said, there's a lot more to cover, so it's time to move on to the blue light diode module of the F1. With a much larger graphic taking up almost the entire 100mm workspace, the engraving settings for the blue light module worked fairly well without many issues. However, during cutting, we quickly found out that our cut settings weren't even remotely close to correct. Similar to the IR module, there was just way too much power, causing the material to catch on fire. I began test cutting squares, being extremely cautious about any burning or melting on the edges of the leatherette. If we saw it on a small scale, it would definitely appear on a larger scale. After numerous tests, I decided to place a small PC fan next to the cut bed of the F1, and that was the trick. The extra airflow made all the difference, and the cut turned out super clean. With this issue resolved, it was time to move on to some real tests with the graphic we tried to cut earlier. Finally, with this configuration, it felt like we were getting somewhere. We achieved a nice mark, and all our cuts were clean. However, this material's not very rigid, so the fan gave it a hard time. Towards the end of the cut, the leatherette popped up over the edge, causing one side of the graphic to be closer to the lens than the other, resulting in additional burning of the material. In the next test, we tucked both edges of the material underneath the cut bed attachment for the F1, resulting in much better cutting performance. It kept everything flat and level, ensuring the material stayed within our depth of field limits. This prevented a larger dot size from forming on one side of the material, greatly improving the final result. Next, we confirmed that these settings were appropriate for the gray leatherette. During cutting, we noticed a hump in the material, which seems to be a common issue with this specific setup. There's no solid way to keep small amounts of this material flat with high air pressure moving around it. Consequentially, the left side of the patch was closer to the scan head than the right, leading to uneven margins. The best advice I have to solve this problem is to use larger sheets. Though it's not an ideal solution, this method was how we managed to get the material flat enough for an even mark and cut throughout. I'm sure many of you have creative solutions in mind, so feel free to share them in the comments. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to engineer a special solution because we had more testing to do. With that, we finalized the settings, and I was content with them. As long as you can get the material material to behave, the settings should work fine with a bit of extra airflow. Here's a quick shot of the final results. You can see some scan lines from the F1, which seems to be inherent to the machine and material combination. They don't bother me too much, and I'm still happy with the outcome, especially because of the depth of the black we achieved with this material. Like the IR module, running crosshatches or multi-angle passes over this material can be tricky due to its thin nature, but I think it would be worth some additional effort to try to register a setting that includes them to clean up the texture of the final mark. Sometimes, though, it's best to leave well enough alone, so I'm calling this one here. These are results I can feel good about, and I think you guys are more than capable of figuring out the crosshatch if you feel it's needed. Next up in our testing lineup, we are looking at the CO2 Galvo. I started off by working on the cut first, then realized I should have begun with marking. While this isn't a huge deal because the leatherette isn't falling through, I couldn't leave it that way, so we moved the material and restarted the test the correct way. Despite the CO2 Galvo having one of the larger dot sizes we work with at our shop, it still performed really well. I specifically included the seagulls in this graphic to test the fine line precision and compare it to other lasers. While the CO2 Galvo may not be the ideal laser for this job, it is certainly serviceable if it's your only option. The text and the branches of the pine trees rendered fairly well, showing good detail. The crosshatch technique on this machine was instrumental in achieving a contrasty look that we were happy with, so I recommend using a crosshatch if you're working with a CO2 Galvo on Leatherette. The cut performance was also strong with this laser. We experienced a few flare-ups, but they were mostly a non-issue. The cuts we ended up with were pretty clean. When trying these settings again on the gray Leatherette, the results were uneventful. The crosshatch helped, cuts were precise and clean, the edges were not an issue. For cleaning, we used, again, a bit of leather cleaner, which I stand by, as it does a great job of bringing out the contrast in this material. It's nothing fancy, just some car, auto leather cleaner, but it works well. Before we move on, let's take a quick look at the final images. You can tell the kerf is substantially higher here than with the other machines we've tested, but still acceptable. I didn't have any issues with the integrity of the material after the cut. Although it looks very close to the edge, it was solid. If I were to do this regularly with this machine, I would probably adjust my file to preserve more space and help the patch stand up to stress in the long term. There is a noticeable decrease in detail throughout the image compared to the other machines we've used. This is evident in the seagulls, again the branches of the trees, and the text. The CO2 Galvo gives more of a branded look rather than a laser marked look, which some people may prefer. This isn't a big deal on larger format projects, so if you're working on something bigger or using a larger lens, you won't notice these tiny details as much. However, if you plan on doing a lot of small items, be aware that you are working with one of the largest dot sizes in laser marking technology, which will make it challenging to achieve finer details, especially on soft materials like this. One final note, the gray Leatherette offers substantially better contrast overall than the brown. This will ultimately be a matter of preference based on who will end up with the final product, but personally, I am a fan of the gray here. We are moving on to the Fiber Galvo now, which I know will be popular with our audience. The initial settings we tried seemed to work pretty well, but something wasn't quite right. It turned out to be a focus issue. It was apparent we weren't getting the definition expected with a fiber laser. Note how the small notches of the compass and the detailed areas of the text lacked definition. Despite the focus issue, the initial cut testing yielded good results, so it seemed we wouldn't need much work in order to achieve success there. We're keeping the cleaning process consistent so the final result photos show consistency in how the products were finished. Cleaning up the first fiber test confirmed that there was an issue with our settings that needed addressing. You may have also noticed fringed edges, indicating that we didn't cut all the way through the material. Next, we tested the gray Leatherette, still unaware of the focus issue. We made minor adjustments to improve previous issues, but being out of focus meant we saw similar results, especially in detail rendering. About 3/4 through this test, I realized the mark was too smudgy and blurry. Something was wrong. The material got so hot that the cut bed left indentations in it. We scrapped the test to reassess. After some unrecorded amount of time, Kyle and I concluded it was a focus issue. With a quick adjustment, we were back on track. The high detailed areas showed significant improvement, rendering much better than before. We felt confident we were on the right track. The benefits of refocusing extended to cut performance, eliminating fringe issues and reducing the number of passes needed to cut the material by about 50%. The final patch lifted right out of the sheet without any issues. We then confirmed these settings for the gray Leatherette. The gray seemed to have much more soot issues, or at least it was more visible than on the brown. My suggestion is to not touch it until the job is complete. The crosshatch technique effectively cleaned up the issue areas, leaving only marginal soot behind. Between the two materials, cut performance remained consistent with no notable differences in colors. Again, the patch lifted right out without a problem. In this clip, I'm demonstrating our consistent cleaning process. For best results, start with one hand holding the edge, move from the center of the leatherette outward, and rotate the patch 360 degrees to pull it evenly in all directions. Be firm but gentle, and use a generous amount of cleaning solution. It's apparent that the refocus had done a stellar job cleaning up the mark, getting us much closer to the expected results. It took some tinkering, but it was worth it. Here we see the final results with the fiber laser. Vibrant, sharp, and clean. There were absolutely no performance issues, and we'll be definitely keeping these settings for future use. The edges were sharp, both in marked areas and along the cut edge, and we're seeing great contrast on both gray and brown leatherettes. Particularly impressive are the ordinal directions, which hold just as much detail in their rendering as the cardinal directions do at a larger scale. If you have a fiber laser and want to process this material, you're in great shape with a little TLC, and it doesn't hurt to make sure you're in focus. Knowing you guys, everyone is looking forward to seeing how the UV laser performed with the synthetic leatherette, so I decided to save the best for last. It shouldn't surprise anyone that getting high quality results with the UV laser was effortless. Even the failed marks could potentially be winners for those looking for something a bit different. In our first attempt, we started with really low power density, which resulted in more of an embossed look than an engraved look. Many of you might be into that, so I included it. Unfortunately, I didn't save the settings for this, but simply reducing the amount of power hitting the material should give you a similar effect. The more passes you add, the darker it gets, and the deeper the emboss effect feels. As cool as it wasn't the target effect we were going for, so I did another quick test with a bit more power to see if we could achieve the desired result on a small scale, since we're starting to run out of materials. I wanted to ensure that we had a nice result to share by the time we did a large-scale test. As expected, the UV laser produced a perfect result on the first try. Moving on to the large-scale test, the results were just perfect. If any of you have processed material with a UV laser, you know that it's really hard to mess something up. The way power is distributed to the material by this laser makes it difficult to ruin a project. Almost everything you target will turn out well. That said, this was done with a 5-watt UV laser, giving me a bit more liberty to play with the settings. Those of you with 10 or 15-watt lasers may need to be more careful to avoid overpowering synthetic materials like this. We clearly got the most vibrant rendering of detail out of the UV laser, and the contrast is unparalleled compared to anything else we've tested. Not only are the edges extremely clean, but they're also soft, giving the results a much more natural feel compared to the other machines. This is especially noticeable compared to the fiber laser, which, while excellent at rendering detail, can feel a bit cold and machined. None of these benefits of the UV laser inhibit its ability to render small details, as seen in the body of the skeleton. The cut performance is unmatched by any other machine we've tested today. This probably isn't surprising, given the dot size of UV lasers. Removing the final patch from the sheet takes literally zero effort. We'll take a look at the gray leatherette to show that the performance is the same between the two materials. The cooler tone of the gray leatherette still feels soft and natural thanks to the UV laser. We're enjoying the high contrast seen with other lasers on the gray leatherette as well. This isn't to say that the brown had poor contrast with the UV. It certainly didn't, but the gray just really pops, making processing this material with the UV all the more impressive. I'll just reiterate because it's impressive to watch. The UV laser absolutely excels in the cut test. It passes through the leatherette like it's not even there, and the resolution of the cut edge is infinitely impressive. UV lasers continue to impress me day after day with their immaculate processing of synthetic materials, and the leatherette is no exception. It isn't simply the final results that make processing this material so satisfying, but the lack of effort required to arrive at these settings. Though not as common as a lot of the other lasers we've tested this material with today, I would absolutely 100% recommend an ultraviolet laser for marking the JP Plus leatherette over any other machine. I think we did very well today with the settings and got great performance out of every machine we tested this material with, but the UV just has an ineffable quality that the others can't seem to match. In closing, I will show all of the images from the final result results of each of the lasers we tested today. Which one was your favorite? Would you have done anything differently? Leave me a comment and let me know. Overall, I'd say this product has exceeded my expectations. Its versatility across all the different laser wavelengths and delivery systems is impressive, and we were able to get a high quality mark out of every single setup we tested today. If you want to pick some of this up, there's a link to the Johnson Plastics Plus website in the description, along with a 15% off coupon code to save a little money on your order. So if you want to support Laser Everything and are interested in checking this material out, head down to the description to find out more. If you got value out of today's video, don't forget to smash the like button and let everyone else know that the content is good. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you get notified the next time we upload a video. We still have quite a bit of material to test from JP Plus, and those videos will be coming out in the near future, including slate, color shop woods, and tumblers, so there's a lot to look forward to. If you really enjoyed today's content and want us to keep producing content like this, please consider signing up for the Laser Master Academy. It's the #1 way to support the channel and funds everything we do here, allowing us to continue doing the work we love. For more information, head over to masters.lasereverything.net or check out some of our other supporter options at lasereverything.net/support. I really do hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I thank you for watching it. A lot of effort went into getting this all together for you, but I had a blast making it, and I'm looking forward to releasing the rest of the videos showcasing some of the quality products Johnson Plastics Plus offers with real-world test scenarios, results, and of course, settings. That's all I've got for now. Thank you once again for stopping by and watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.